first of all, I should say I'm afraid to say that my title is slightly overambitious, because I'll actually be talking about medieval Radnorshire, the old divisions of Gwerthrynion, Maelienydd, and Elfail, with some forays further east, over the border, as it were, to that realm that we might call virtual Wales in Herefordshire, culturally and linguistically Welsh in places like Hargest, Bredwardine, and Witney down over there on the eastern side. So the main focus is on the 15th century, when the poetic sources get really plentiful. Between about 1400 and 1600, roughly, there are about 160 poems to Radnorshire patrons, again with some 28 over the border. So now there's been quite a revolution with this corpus of poetic material. And the true hero was our own Francis Payne. He was brought up in Kington, but he was devoted to our county. And his two books, Crwydro Sirfau Syfed, in 1966, and the second volume in 1968, were a real revolution, with quotations from poems introducing the medieval inhabitants of Radnorshire, the living, moving people, as he said, their homes and interiors, their husbandry and possessions, their interests and their ideals. There was an important inventory done by Tegwen Llwyd in her 1982 thesis, and then we have new editions of many of the poems which have really transformed the field. Above all, David Johnston's edition of Lewis Glyn Cothi, who was from near Carmarthen, and he was the most prolific of the visiting bards. He was the most learned too, a skilled scribe, and very likely a cleric. He had an eye for style and interiors. You know, he's the type who might today be writing for Homes and Gardens. The other poet we'll meet a lot tonight is Llawdden, from up Montgomeryshire way, just as engaging and confident, a bit stout, we learn, and more interested in animals. Now he ends up farming in Cefn-Llys, and he's more of a farming weekly sort of bloke. Now, Llawdden's work has been edited by Iestyn Daniel as part of this wonderful series on the poetry of the gentry, which has been masterminded by Anne Parry-Owen. Now, these are all Welsh language editions, and most of the material isn't available in English, but I should mention that Francis Payne's volumes have been translated by Di Hawkins in the Transactions of the Radnorshire Society for the years 2008 and 2009. He actually, it actually says 2010, but I think they caught up with the numbers of the transactions, and they had two extra volumes, as it were, by Di Hawkins, Davy the Garth. There are also some fine translations on the web by that elusive character, Radnorian, and he has a very interesting blog at Tredelin blogspot.com. So we'll visit some real medieval people and see how they were described in their own domestic settings by these poets, who were the chattering classes of their day, but real professionals and networkers traveling from patron to patron and being rewarded for their public praise with money and lavish board and lodging, a range of movable goods, clothes and textiles, and various animals and birds, as we'll see. Now, there's been much advance on the kind of here and now of literary production and performance. and also on realia, with the real objects and places coming more into focus. And of course, in Radnorshire, we've been wonderfully served, first of all, by Harry Brooksby, and especially so by Richard Suggett. His book you can see here, and I'm very indebted to this book for some of the pictures which will follow. Many of the more splendid early examples are in the warmer, lower parts of the county, like this example here, Great House in Newchurch. But there are substantial upland houses as well, such as Carchell or Crachell in Llanano, and Croes Cannon. This is Lower Croes Cannon. Both of these in Llanano. And then there are other houses in this sort of area you can see on the map here, Gardd Faelog and Llynwent, both in Llanbista, which were frequented by the poet Llawdden. These old houses no longer stand. So it's great when we can match up poems to actual houses, as we'll see. But where a gentry house no longer stands, a poem can sort of bring it back into view again, if you like. Now, I'm no climate or economic historian, but I think at this period, we're at the very tail end of the so-called medieval warm period, before it's turned colder again from about 1500. After recovery from the Black Death in the 14th century and from the Glyndŵr Rising in the early 15th century, there was more prosperity, and there was a boom in the squirearchy, the gentry, if you like, and many of them proud descendants of noble lines, some of them holding administrative offices, straddling the Anglo-Welsh divide as well in some cases. There seems to have been a very successful stock farming of cattle. This is noted by Lewis Glencothi as he praised Dafydd Goch ap Howell from St. Harmon, whose herds in their thousands, as he says, flecked the vast pastures in the upper reaches of the Wye and the Marteg, Blaen Marchteg in Welsh. Here indeed was a gŵr ariannog digryno. He was a man of means and generous with it. Now down in Llanefan, in the middle there, in the purple, Llanefan is just beyond Llandegli. He mentions the fact that the estate there had 2 gardens, 2 sweet orchards and lakes, a dovecot and fields of corn. Then further east again in New Radnor, Lewis noted how Llywelyn, the constable of the castle, had been accruing land and prospering mightily. Now, in all these different locations, there was, of course, a drink on offer, whether ale from Webley in Herefordshire, or mead, or things like a raspi, which was a sweet wine from Spain. But prosperity and status were expressed in what has been called a golden age of Welsh vernacular architecture, and hall houses were theatres really for conspicuous consumption and public validation by the poets. There's been for a long time, there's been an idea that Radnorshire somehow was poor, static, outside time somehow. But in the 15th century, it was certainly a hot spot of patronage. And this is what gives us a direct view into the lives of this privileged class. Well, creature comforts. Well, I don't think these have changed really all that much over the centuries. We still like the same things, a cozy, dry house, no smoking chimneys and no drafts, fires and candles to lighten the darkness, a warm bed with a nice cover, some good food and drink, perhaps with fashionable new ingredients, just like posh people now might go for Wagyu beef or something like that. Stylish warm clothes, comfortable saddles and chaps for riding and so on. Comfort too if you had peace and safety, no lawlessness. If you had mellifluous poems wishing you well, if you had music and books to read or hear read, medicines and salves on hand if you were ill, and the comfort of trusting in God and the saints, the beloved local guardians like Cynllo or Saint David, Dewi, and Padarn, and also knowing that you were doing your bit, gaining grace through charity as well as conspicuous hospitality. So we'll start off with the houses themselves. Now, poets took up the genre of the new house poem with great verve. They took their cue from the very famous poem by Iolo Goch to Owain Glyndwr Summer Residence, which was newly built at the end of the 14th century with all mod cons in Sycharth. In fact, Iolo Goch in his poem describes the whole estate, in fact, as we saw with Llanefan a minute ago. So here the buildings are likened to famous churches like Westminster or to the bustling streets of Cheapside in London. Llanefan, in turn, was compared to the Cistercian house of Whitland. Now, a well-known example of a new house poem is on our own doorstep at Cefn Llys in a great loop of the River Eithon. There'd been a garrisoned stone castle up there from the 13th century, the chief fortification in the Maeliennydd region. In the 1470s, perhaps, a new timber court residence was built on the castle bankside by the constable Ieuan ap Philip, who is actually subject of 3 praise poems by Lewis Glencothi, 2 of which concentrate on this new hall. Dark-haired Ieuan is praised as the he's praised as the planet of Ieithon. He was clearly skilled in administration and law, and the poem has a roll call of other legal types, justices and justiciars in Hereford and Shropshire. They all indicate the sort of circles that Ieuan was moving in. So it's no surprise that this actual manuscript, which is a law book, Peniarth 40 in the National Library, that this was actually written for him, and actually and interestingly by the poet Lewis Glencothi himself. And Lewis added the poems at the beginning here, the poems to the Cefn Llys poems, which were also written by him in 2 other manuscripts, in Peniarth 70 and in Peniarth 109, as you can see there on the bottom. Now, Lewis's poem reminds us how Cefn Llys was named Ymbrut Mawr y Mort Meriaid, he says, in the great chronicle of the Mortimers, perhaps referring back to the tumultuous events of the 13th century, so well described in David Stevenson's latest book about Howell ap Meirig. And now Ieuan, Master of Law, as he's called, or Master for Law in Swydd Ieithon, has rekindled the old hearth. And it's interesting that he uses here an Old Welsh legal term, dadanhyddo, to rekindle or to reclaim. He's reclaimed the site. He's made a new build within the old site. And he describes, the poem describes then the moated octagonal fort, which is set within, as he says, within 12 circles, high above the river. And Ieuan is then compared to various legendary founders of cities. So pa wal gastell pa wal gystal wrth gastell, a'r wal bir fel Caerloyw bell. Castell gwyn mewn llynwyn llawn, Caer wrth 8 ochr, uwch cwr ieithon. Caer Roeg mewn 12 gwregus, cyfenw y lle yw Cefn Llys. So you have a description of the interwoven ash and oak and the stout roof, which is like a shield. And all these things have restored the site, which he says is like a sick place, now one in full health. He says it ascends to the sky like a lark in May. He actually names the master builder. He says the axe of the master builder, Rhosher ab Owain, has made a wondrous structure, he says, the parts all tightly interlocking, like King Arthur's famous hall, Ehangwen. And the poem lends it an aura of sanctity. It's compared to St. David's, it's compared to Bardsey, it's compared to Dinefwr, St. Oswald's in Oswestry. It's said to be an altar, a relic, a shining and blessed. And what's interesting is that there's a further, perhaps more topical comparison fitting for a site under Yorkist control, because he mentions a Sandal Castle, which is near Wakefield. This is a site of one of the big wars of the Roses in 1460. So Ieuan, the constable here, is said to be like a stag on the high mountain, and his wife and kinswoman, Angharad, who we'll meet again later on, is described as his moon, his holy lamp. So we'll move on next to a house which we can still see, and this is Bryn Drainog on the road from Knighton up to Bugaildy, with the River Teme there on your right. It stands at the entrance to Cwm Rhingyll. Rhingyll is the word meaning a reeve, and the family there was descended from the 14th century Hywel Athro, or teacher or one learned in law. And the family, in fact, may have been a dynasty of such officials. And the building itself was probably built by Hywel's grandson, Llywelyn Vychan ab Ieuan, and perhaps it was just one of the properties associated with this family. It's one of the largest houses and one of the earliest, built with timbers, if I can go on. It was built with timbers felled in 1436. And Harry Brooksbury commented that Bryn Drainog would be outstanding in Herefordshire or in Sussex. And he reckoned that it was possibly the finest hall house in all of the Principality. Richard Suggett, more recently, has suggested very convincingly that it may have been used by Richard, Duke of York, heir to the Mortimer estates, as a stopping off place midway between Ludlow, the administrative centre, and the lordships to the north up in Montgomery. Now, the poet in this case who describes the house was Ieuan ab Hywel Swrdwal from the Newtown area. You see his name there. And the house was new when he saw it. It was one of a trio, he says, of magnificent stars, radiating light like the Star of Bethlehem or the star portent of Owain Glyndŵr. And the whole, idea of light and darkness and light and brightness runs throughout the poem. He says it's like a proud maiden of lime and wood, the daughter of the fine weather, the countess of the summer. It's like a sun or a candle. And in fact, the poet is so overcome that he isn't sure that this could be the work of a man, or was it the work of an angel or a goldsmith from heaven? He says specifically that he saw a street of windows, a strad or fenestri, matching the vast adorned windows, one of which still survives. And he also talks specifically of glazing in the window, which is another sign of the affluence of the owners of this period. And once again, like Cefn-Llis, the house is compared with churches and mercantile centres, and the fabled courts of Arthurian legend. I wanted to show you the reconstruction of the hall of Bryn Draenog as it's been, the reconstruction here, and there's very high status carpentry in the trusses and the couples. And Richard Suggett, I think, has pointed out how very well mirrored the ornateness of the carpentry is, and how well it matches with the very intricate cynganedd of the verse and of the poems, of the poem itself. So Ieuan, the poet, hopes that Llywelyn will live as long as Noah to enjoy his new court. Now, just half a mile away, also on the Bardic itinerary, but a century and a half later, we've got Pantacaregl, and the poet here, Lewis Dunn, goes through and describes this house. He goes through the rooms rather like an estate agent, going through the 3 floors, the kitchens, the buttery, the parlour, the towers, etc. And this stone-tiled house, he says, was also like a bright lamp. There's a change of emphasis now, though, whereas the older houses extended wide, height is the big thing now. Neuadd Uchel, a high hall. And elsewhere, poems of this period describing houses describe them as towers or fair cliffs. Their rooms on top of each other, commanding great views across the country and having high chimneys, like Lewis Dunn describes Llywes Court as having chimneys that gored the mist. It's about as different as you can get from this modern house here in Llanbista, the Life House with the architect John Pawson, who's kept everything as low as it could possibly be there. Well, these newer 16th century gentry houses like Llandewi Hall or Far Hall in Dolau were often sited at crossroads or at the roadside, and they were often used as not just as private residences, but as places of administration and transactions. And one poet pinpoints this by describing the owner of Mynachdy, or Manorty, as we say, as the lord of the roads of Bleddfa. Now, figuring large in this period are poems of request or thanks, well studied by my colleague in Aberystwyth, Bleddyn Hughes. Many of these poems are either requesting or thanking for horses, weapons, and animals, and objects seen publicly to be given to the poets in return for their poems. Real objects, certainly, even things like beehives, or we even have one for a chastity belt. Watkin Vachan of Hargest was even approached by the poet Bedo Brwynllys for a pair of glasses, described as 2 wheels over the nose. So objects were described and transformed by vivid metaphors like this, which weave in extra levels of connotation. So we look at 3 examples to do with soft furnishings and clothes, all by Lewis Glencothi. Francis Payne called him a diligent collector of textiles. And we can also refer to him as the poet of the wives too, because as his editor, David Johnston, stressed, he gives a lot of attention to the wives as well as the patrons. Well, both husband and wife can be acting as patrons, as Lewis often said. So we'll go back to Cefn Llys for a moment, and here Lewis addresses Angharad, the wife of Ieuan, the constable, who we met earlier, and he thanks her for giving him, wine from Greece, and he praises her lineage, and he says, well, he's now her old and faithful poet, and he says how much he's feeling the cold. He says the fish are freezing in the rivers, and there's more bad weather forecast in what he calls the moon books. And he gives thanks for all these reasons for an arras coverlet or mantle. It's called llen in Welsh, which is a bit ambiguous. But he says it's been embroidered by a Lombard, somebody from Lombardy. And he says that this will keep him warm on his travels. And then he goes into a great description of the item. It's like a garden, he says, with leaves and yellow groves on a dark woven background. Now, there are no religious motifs on it, but the metaphors do the work instead and invest the gift with meaning beyond the purely material. So he says it's like the banner of St. David's Church. It's like the stained glass windows of Westminster Church. Indeed, he says it's been made from the fleece of the sheep of paradise, or the fleece of the peacock, 20 pounds in weight. Of course, all this stresses Angharad's piety, as well as the fine domestic goods which she has at her disposal. She's a holy housewife, if you like. Now, about 12 miles away in Gleydystri, Lewis Glencothi went after another item, a mantle, a scarlet mantle of wool, and he says specifically that this was one of the highly fashionable scarlet items made in Dublin. Scarlet was very prized for its dense weave because it doesn't ravel. And the poet hints at the beginning that he's seeking a textile because he describes the giver, Ellis or Alice Hall, originally from Harpton Court near Old Radnor. He describes her as somebody whose skin is very pale. She has the color of a nun's robe. And he refers right at the beginning to the story of Jason's fleece. And then he comes on to talking about the item itself. The garment, he says, that he wants is round like a sail. It was a summer treasure, but it was woven in the depths of winter. Tlws haf a weoid y gaeaf. He says it's a chasuble, it's God's own raiment, like the burning torches at a saint's feast, or a weft of fire and wool. So all the reds, all the warm, descriptions, you really feel the warmth in the colors which are mentioned so often. Now, by the seam of it, Lewis's request is for his own wife, Gwenllian, which adds to the kind of pathos, if you like. So the third example takes us west to a more famous Gwenllian, illegitimate daughter of Owain Glyndŵr, now living with her husband, Philip ap Rhys, at Cenarth, near St. Harmen. Now, there's a substantial dossier of poems to this family, stressing their connections to Glyndŵr's princely line, and also to Philip's forebears, who were famous patrons over in Cardiganshire in the Iron Valley. Now, Llaw then has a request poem for a sword and shield, on behalf of Owain Glyndwr's son, Shankin. This is a good example of networking via this sort of gift exchange. Now, John Hughes, Llanidloes, has made excellent use of these poetic materials in his novel, Glyndwr's Daughter, and he spoke, of course, to this group, to the Trust, a few years back. Now, in one poem, Lewis Glencothi makes for Kennarth just as a ship follows the diamond on a needle of a compass, he says. His haven is Philip's Hall in Kennarth, which is the true north of mead and molten gold. Now, this is a really up-to-date metaphor because it's thought that marine navigation by compass in the West is only attested from about 1410. There was a bit of confusion in medieval times between the diamond and the lodestone, which you see reflected here. And another really up-to-date, quite exotic comparison that Lewis Glencothi has, and not in this poem, but in another poem, is when he says to another patron that he himself rings out praise like one of the bells in Osney. Now that's in Oxfordshire. So he's ringing out like one of the bells of Osney. Now, two of these bells, which were cast in 1410 by John Bird of London, they're still ringing because they are now in Christ Church, Oxford. And that's just by the way. So if we return to the poem in question, which I want to look at now, the poem in question involves a request for a bed, and it involves a consortium of 4 women who are approached by Lewis for a bed complete with hangings and coverlets. Now, 3 of these local ladies we know were patrons of his because we've got other poems to them. There's one, for example, to Eva, who was the daughter of Llywelyn from Rhaeadr, and she had given the poet a rosary. So there are 4 women. They're described as being like 4 Marys, like 4 Saint Nons, and one imagines that they were probably all together at a feast in Kennarth. And after praising the largesse in their 4 houses, he goes on to request this fine square bed, where he imagines his own son will soon be lolling. The hangings have squares on them too, and he, as he says, like a chessboard, mal chess. And the sort of checkered, making checkered fabric was a popular design at this period because it enabled you to use cheaper cloths and to combine them effectively with more sumptuous fabrics. You could economize a bit by doing that. But in this poem, we have raw silk mentioned, caddis, green brocade, and linen, as well as the white feathers. They're all mentioned in the poem. Now, of course, there are 4 patrons here being approached. The number 4, of course, symbolized perfection and harmony as well. So that's an extra kind of level, if you like. And in the heightened metaphorical run, which is at the heart of the poem, the bed is transformed, sanctified, if you like. He says it's like an altar of sleep, allor gusg. It's a vehicle to paradise. It's a kind of mobile Rouen cathedral. It's a bed of angels. Now, we'd really like to know whether Lewis got what he wanted, which would be a very substantial gift indeed, but not impossible, perhaps, for this well-heeled foursome. Or was he just wanting the textiles and covers on the bed? Or have we got here instead, or as well as, a metaphorical request for continued bed and board white bread and ale and mead in each of their houses in turn. Well, mention of valuable substances like fur and velvet and silk and brocade, of course, brought a whiff of Paris and beyond with them. And food exotica are also noted with relish at the Drabnashire gentry tables. Just a few I've noticed include balsam, oranges, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, ginger, pepper, sugar candy, as well as something called pumparis, which are pears like apples, and apples of paradise. I'm not quite sure what they are, but the color of food is stressed. You know, you think antioxidants for the rich and beige foods, perhaps, or boiled cabbage for the poor. But meat was the big thing, and in quantity, roasted on spits, marinated, or boiled in wine. Not just the tame beasts you've got around, but wild boar and venison to seal your status. In Harpton, Old Radnor, Lewis Glencothi lists, you know, what gives you a bit of a menu, if you like, and he lists fish and broth, birds in bread, pasties, old good drink, as well as white sugar. And Llawdden, the other poet, is very vivid in his descriptions of peacocks being brought to the table. Peacocks, according to another source, were prepared by blowing down a quill inserted into the head. You blow down that to inflate the skin, taking off the skin and feathers and all, just leaving the flesh. And then you'd cook it up and serve it at the table in full plumage. And this is described quite graphically in a poem by Llawdden. Of course, there's drink in every poem, different kinds of drink, ale and braggot, whether home brewed or the superior version from Webley in Herefordshire, and any amount of wine from, you know, Gascony, the Rhone, the Loire, Spain. Morgan ap Howell from Croes Cynnon and Llanbister used to buy in Burgundy wine by the barrel. And of course, mead was the traditional and the top drink. And that this was very much prized because it was a produce of your very own land itself, as it were. Now, the request poems never asked directly for food and drink because this was sort of almost like a given of hospitality. But nevertheless, it could be worked into poems asking for other things. For instance, Lewis asks for a pair of cows from two married women. They're called Annes Aubrey and Isabel Ferch Rhys. They're both from Elfyle, from the southern part of the county. And these two cows are described as being two stout barrels, like the cattle of the Berwyn Mountains. He goes on to describe their milk then as white as new Gascon wine. And he says the animals between them have got 8 taps, the others, therefore, gushing medicine, he says, physic. So, and unlike hard liquor making you drunk and deaf and dizzy, this drink, the milk, would helps the awen, or the poetic inspiration. So Llawdden, as I said, is especially good on animal husbandry. And sometime after 1469, he approaches Watkin Vychan of Hargest, asking for 2 black oxen because he's been struggling on trying to plough upland slopes with 2 beasts, and now he needs 2 more. He says he's getting on now, and he'll soon have to give up trailing around the country, the Clera Gwlad, as he calls it, the poet's life on the road. he describes, interestingly, how his bed is right by the manger, so that he can keep an eye on the oxen in case of brigands. He says he lies there making his poems while they're chewing their cud, with their rhythmic breathing and chewing like the movement of the sea, he says. And he says also, like the pulse of a harp accompaniment when poetry is being declaimed. It's pretty graphic there. Well, he must have got his request, because he goes on then to ask Dafydd Mathai down in Llandaf, down in Glamorgan, for 2 more oxen. He wants 2 red oxen this time. And he plays on the fact that Watkin has already obliged. And the beasts now, he describes those in great detail. He says they're like 2 fat boars, unshod, who will till the earth with iron and wood. He says that their horns are higher than the branches of the trees. The fact that they're red, of course, invites vivid comparisons. They're sanguine, he says, bloody, like a flaming candle, red velvet, coals of the fire. And he finishes up by asking the benediction of Saint Cirig and Saint Idlois on both Watkin in Hargest and Dafydd Mathai down in Glamorgan. And then finally he goes to Richard Turberville in Glamorgan again, and this time he wants a red bull, and he describes this again interestingly, with a head like an elephant, a long tail like an old lion. And the quotation I have there, he's a tarw o borfa Turberville, a turkey o raspir a spine. He's, as you can see, he's like a Turk of the color of Spanish red wine. His flank is like the soil of Brycheiniog, which of course is famously red in color. So the Turk here, of course, stands for ferocity. It was often used in names of oxen, actually. Pairs like Turk and tiger, lark and linnet. You get these rhyming, alliterating pairs, silk and sewin. So the red bull here is graphically described as raring to go. And he finishes up by saying that this bull will make calves in Cefn Llys. Yw na lloi yng nghefn y llys. A very common ask then by the poets was a horse. It's one of the most common, actually. Llaw then in Hargest again requested a stallion on behalf of Watkin's cousin, Sean of Bredwardine. He describes it as its mane plaited like the waves of the sea, great calves' eyes with a nape rising like that of a boar's hackles. It's got the shoulder of a bull, a long tail like an eel, shiny horseshoes sending up sparks. Lewis had a more modest request for a harness and decorated horsecloth from 2 patrons in Llansanfraid and Elfail. And he's just asking for that, but he hints that the Earl of Pembroke will give him the horse to go with these things. So often they're sort of, touching somebody in order to, to increase their gains, as it were. No, the request genre is one that was open to parody and also open to being, used in a comic way. And Lewis does this when he asks the men of Elfail for a horse, and he says that he wants a horse as tame as a sheep. And the reason is that he's now an old man. He says he's as bald as the Van Mountain, and he himself is as tame as a swan. So he doesn't want anything too frisky or too headstrong. And he says he'll need a specially adapted bridle to stop the horse jumping around. and also a smooth saddle. Because in the similar vein, he sort of asks for a kind of mobility aid. He asks Meredith of Beert for a kind of an orthopedic saddle, if you like, one that's easy for him as an old man to get up and down from. That Meredith ap Beert was actually the brother of the Lord of Llysdinan, Llysdinan in Llanafan by Newbridge there. Now, we've already seen how game was so prized at the table. And hand in hand, of course, with that comes hunting, which is part and parcel of gentry behaviour. And the praise poems often mention the extent of their hunting territory. So Thomas Vychan down there in Bredwardine, it said that he tracked along the banks of the Wye and all the land between Machaoy and Edwy, the two rivers. Then the wedding ode for Robert of Witney, just on the Wye there, the wedding ode has tremendous long lists of what's there, what's going to be in the house. It lists 100 hounds and the dog handlers, as well as all the other retainers. And in these poems, we even hear of the baying of the beagles up in Llynwent, up in Llanvista way. And here's in the dyfaniad, in the quotation I have there, gwrandaw byth o'r grund y bo a'r hied yn rhoi wô. So he says that Meredith is being, he's always listening there from the ground, low on the ground, listening to the hound beagle baying this sound ooh, which he tries to convey there in the sound. Well, naturally, there are poems requesting dogs and hawks and knives and other equipment. And Bedw Brynllys in Breconshire wanted a hound, he says, as tall as a camel. So you get these exotic things coming into the descriptions very often. Llaw then asked for a pair of white dogs on behalf of Meredith Vychan up in Gardd Faelog. He describes them as being like bishops or white monks. Their shiny coats like a stamin, which is worsted cloth or linen. They're as white as the gleaming quartz stone found in Gwynedd. So you can see how these metaphors go in all directions. And they're not just about the object, but they capture interest right across the board. And if I can make a quick excursus just to make this point clear, there's a praise poem, a very fine praise poem to Meredith Vychan of Llynwent and Llanvista, a piece which is called, it's called a tunic poem, Cawydd y Bais in Welsh, and it explains how Meredith Vychan, he was a very generous patron of poets, and a lot of poets called at his house. So he now, metaphorically, wears a garment, metaphorically, a multi-authored garment of fame around him. And the poet himself, Gwilym ab Ieuan Hen, in this instance, he boasts that his own needle isn't blunt either, i.e. that he's been contributing to this garment of fame, which is wrapped around his patron. And he talks about a casil or eiria cyson. This garment is like a chasuble of consistent words. So coming back to the hunting theme, Llaw then has a great poem of thanks actually to a Montgomeryshire patron, but he asks for a red stag skin. He says the meat will be cooked on the spit and the offal will be smoked in wine, but he wants the skin, and he wants the skin because he wants it as a camouflage, to wear as a camouflage when he's out hunting. So in this close-fitting skin, he says, not unlike John the Baptist in his skin, he says the deer will think that he's one of them. Now, hawks were very much in demand, and there are several poems. Llawdden asked Robert of Witney for a goshawk. He asked actually on behalf of another patron. He describes the round beak as being like a crossbow. Its two wings stretched out like an open book. You can see how apt that is. More to the point, of course, the goshawk is able to capture birds for the table. He lists these: woodcock, capercaillie, ceiliog coed, perhaps pheasant, better than physic, herons, ducks, bittern and lapwing, all of these which will be served up at the table with a bit of sugar. Now, at this period, there's more domestication of birds. So you get, as I said, requests for peacocks, their silky plumage, again, like glass, church glass windows. Their feathers were in demand for lovers' garlands, and they were, of course, destined for a table centerpiece, especially, I think, at Christmas and New Year. And one of Llawdden's most attractive poems is when he thanks a Gwent patron for 2 young swans for himself. He starts off with this great line, the first line: "Y ddau giw oedd wir gynt." The 2 youngsters used to be eggs, or the 2 young swans that were eggs, and he goes on to describe them as being like horses on the sea, or like windmills with great sails. And he notes, interestingly, how their necks are like the letter S, and how their folded wings, you can see in the picture, folded back like the letter W on its side. What's curious is that these 2 letters, S and W, are the first 2 letters of the English word swan as well. So that may be an extra kind of level of intricacy here. Now, swans were expensive, but they were cheap to rear, I understand. So let's hope that Llawdden did well on them. Now, health was known to depend partly on diet, and indeed things that I mentioned earlier, pepper, saffron, some of the spices were, known to be therapeutic, and in some instances things like that could be thought to ward off melancholy, for example. And somebody like Anne Harrad in Cefn Llys, she's praised not just for textiles, but she's praised for providing therapeutic mead and spiced drinks, as well as healing herbs. Just beyond our area, over in Cardiganshire, I think, Lewis Glencothi notes some, health-giving, specific health-giving things, including these things that I've mentioned here. Custard apple. I did find a custard apple in Aberystwyth last week, and it was quite tasty, but I don't know about its therapeutic qualities either. But anyway, a custard or a custard apple. And he mentions also a pomegranate, Bungernard. And he mentions wine, of course, as you'd expect, a compound to deal with a nasty fit, a cyflaeth rhag cainc o afles, fine young fowl, ciwion teg, and also grains or seeds possibly against fever. So these things are listed all together in a poem which is talking about trying to get somebody well. It would be a comfort, of course, to people to know that there were medics on hand, and of course poets who were willing to, who were willing your recovery, the therapy in a poem, which was wishing you to get better. Now Llaw then has one of these, and he wishes our friend Meredith Vachan of Gardd Felog, he wishes him recovery. He's got a bad leg. I'm not quite sure what happened to his leg, but anyway, it was being treated by a medic, and the medic is named as Thomas Duppa in Welsh, Thomas Duppa or Duppa, and it's said that he is skilled in the Hippocratic craft, and he is working alongside St. Peter and the Virgin Mary to effect a cure, and of course also mentions the prayers of all Meredith's kinsfolk. And he asks St. Kirig to help a scar form so that it'll all heal up, so that Meredith can stride again with vigour, even as far as the Gordor further north with his 2 hunting dogs. Now, if we come down to Rhaeadr, down to the town, Rhaeadr, this was the home of the old soldier Bedw Goch ap Meredydd. He was also a skilled harpist, and he was eventually killed by a cannonball in Boulogne. Anyway, this tough old warrior had already undergone some kind of plastic surgery on his face, which is described by Lewis as a soldered tenter of grace between the teeth and the cheek, a sidanwaith ar draws wyneb, which is a work of silk across the face, in the shape, as he says, of a letter S. And again, he mentions who the surgeon was. This was Griffith ab Ieuan, who had all the skills of the famous physicians of Myddfai down in Carmarthenshire. And the poet prays that he'll make a good recovery, aided by what he calls the ointment of the angels. Now, other people, of course, would be seeking relief and comfort at healing wells near at hand, for example, up in Pillath. I think that was somewhere you went, especially if you had trouble with your eyes. Other people would travel far, going further, perhaps to the Rood in Brecon or Chester or Carmarthen, or further afield again, like Shankin ap Havard from Pont William in Breconshire. He sailed with 3 rich female companions across the Bay of Biscay to Santiago de Compostela, and they went in the ship, the Mary of Bristol. Poems, of course, can often list, they can reveal what people most feared. Things like, well, illness, violence and banditry, that's often mentioned, pangs and pestilence, fever, boils, ague, as well as wounds inflicted with steel and iron. And there are actually very many tender elegies from our area, which must have been, of considerable comfort to the bereaved. Now, I've talked about comforts of the bodily and spiritual kind, and these were undoubtedly augmented by entertainment and mental stimulation, and the poetry itself was part of that. What else did we have? Well, at Lewis ap Watkins' house in Painscastle, there was playing with dice and cards and games on checkered boards, as well as dancing and gambling. So that was the place to go. Painscastle was where it was at, obviously, for high life. Now, we noticed already that many patrons were involved in local administration. Many of them were very civilized, highly literate, and some we know were well up in illegal texts. We have a nice vignette of Dafydd ap Rhys. He is in Old Radnor there, reading texts with his poet, Lewis Glencothi, and both of them having a good look and succeeding in making sense of some difficult old poetry. In this case, the manuscript in question is almost certainly one of the 4 ancient books of Wales, as they're called, and the famous Book of Taliesin, which you see here on the slide, which was written in the first half of the 14th century, possibly in Cwmhir. Now, we know the manuscript was in Avonjob and Harpton in the 16th century. It was in the possession of Hugh Miles, then the historian John Lewis Llinwenny, who were all kinsmen of this learned patron, Dafydd ap Rhys of Old Radnor. So Lewis Glencothi and Llawdden make much reference to texts and stories in all their poems. They clearly expected the audience to have heard of Prester John or Jason and the Golden Fleece, tales of Troy and Rome, as well as Urien Rheged and Merlin and the Arthurian heroes and figures from Welsh history and literature. You've got a sort of textual community, I think, here. And you have people like Felpot ap Rhys there, in Brilly, which just north of Hay there. He was praised specifically for his fine Welsh, his mastery of stories, chwedlau in Welsh, and his mastery of the chronicles of Britain and of the 7 liberal arts. And one of his sons, Sean, was a poet himself, and he could turn his hand to satirize the poet Hywel Dafydd, who was the court poet of Tritawa in Brecconshire. And he gives him a real roasting, calls him fat and useless. And this was really because Hywel Dafydd had gone up a bardic grade and had transferred now his attentions to Sean's brother, Thomas, who could reward him better. So that was really why he was being satirized here. Then there's another example of, well, that's a good example perhaps of the kind of joking relationship which could often exist between the patron and a poet who was usually himself fairly well born. Now, down in Llansanfraid and Elfail, you had 2 sons of Ieuan Goch, and they lived in houses a bowshot apart from each other, and Lewis describes scuttling between the 2, never needing to consult a book about poetic craft, Cerdd Dafod, because brother Hywel had it all off by heart, so he could consult him if he was in difficulty. Then Thomas ap Rhys up in Llangynllo, he is described as being extremely fluent and witty, sharp as pepper. I dafod parod fegis peren abal, a wnai bob parabl yn bipiren. Now, I haven't gone into the 16th century much because that would involve discussing later poets such as Morgan Elfail from Dyserth. His work is, there's a lot of poetry, and that work is still waiting to be edited. Also, Hywel ap Sir Matthew of Llanfair Waterdene, just over the team, the other side of the team, was a poet. He was a translator and a chronicle writer of some note. But I hope I've given you some taste of the 15th century poetry in this area. Now, to finish up, though, I have to tackle the question which almost certainly is going through your mind. How real are these literary creations? what is their historical worth? So if I could just touch on a few points as I see things to finish up. Well, firstly, the poems are obviously an artistic response to the material world. And we've seen clearly that metaphors and comparisons lend a sort of aura or an added value to them. So the new hall was not actually Westminster, the Red Bull wasn't actually a dragon, the Swan wasn't actually a ship in full sail, the mantle wasn't actually the Golden Fleece, but the animals, birds and objects are not figments of the imagination, and nor could they be in such a context of patronage and public performance. Then you might ask, well, what about hyperbole? Did Kevin Cleese Hall really have 100 chambers, 18 streets and 18 dwellings? Was there really white bread for 1,000 widows every year in Llaneran? Well, probably not, any more than we are telling the truth when we have hundreds of jobs to do or tons of work. Things are bigger and better, the best versions of themselves, as are the people you think perhaps filtered photo or adjusted selfie. All the same, as Francis Payne said, we are dealing with living, moving people in a way unparalleled for this area and period. You know, we learn more about people. We learn about people who might just be names in the genealogies. For example, you have there Rhys ap Griffith of Glascombe. We don't really know much about him, but a poem tells us that he had a calm, low, sweet speaking voice. Isel a doeth a melys ydyw'r hyn a ddyweto Rhys, calm and collected. And then we have Master Griffith Lewis. He was the priest of Old Radnor, and he's described by a northern poet, Lewis Morn, and he's described as a fitness freak, swimming faster than any fish, jumping, running, throwing, everything really. And were it not for the poetry, you wouldn't know that. Neither would you know that Meredith Vychan had a child, an illegitimate child, with a servant girl, a child who was fostered by the poet Llawdden and his wife Annes without Meredith's wife knowing. And indeed, it's a poem that tells us how Lewis Glencothi was ribbed by his Yorkist patron for supporting Jasper Tudor. So that rather suggests that, like people did over Brexit, you know, people could sometimes agree to differ. Now, the next point, of course, is that we have very limited realia left from the period, apart, of course, from some houses. Things like clothes and hangings and other textiles have mostly gone for good, but at least the poetry gives us a sense of what kinds of things the gentry had and what they prized in their houses. And it gives us as well something of their hopes and fears. And clearly, this material has severe class limitations. I mean, much of the comfortable life we've looked at was facilitated by labouring and serving men and women whose stories are rarely told. And Welsh place names now, as you probably know, are very much on the agenda these days. And the poetry, as with medieval poetry in general, often preserves earlier forms of names which have changed over the course of time. We see Lewis Glencothi using Kevin Llys as well as Kevin Cleese. He uses whichever he needs for his meter, actually. The river Aethon is always Ieithon. We have The Penarth is Bryn Penarth, the older form. Craigreina is Craig Virina. Llanheilo is Llwyn Hoedliw. As I said earlier, Marteg, the Marteg Brook is Marchdeg. And Llys Dinam, which we say now by Newbridge there, was the form as used by Lewis is Llys Dinan. So there are many more examples of this, of course. So if I can finish up to conclude, there are accidents of survival, of course, and it's very disappointing that there aren't any 15th century poems surviving to come here. Unlike many other Cistercian houses which were visited by poets like Gitor Glyn in Valle Crucis, for example, and Strata Florida. But making up for this loss, perhaps, is the exceptionally fine 12th century elegy to the reputed founder, Prince Cadwallon ap Madog ab Idnerth, murdered in 1179. Now, this poem, this is absolutely top grade stuff here by Cynfelw, the best of the court poets. He sang also to Princess Eva, who became Cadwallon's wife, and that is an exceptional poem, the first full-length praise poem of a woman we have in Welsh. Finally, I'd like to say that this Welsh language literary past is a really exciting dimension of an area which became so thoroughly and, as it seemed, irrevocably anglicized. There was, without a doubt, a long forgetting, really, until Francis Payne's pioneering work was published. But things have changed again, and new generations, as well as adult learners, are now recovering the language. And this literary past will surely be a source of inspiration and pride as it becomes better known. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope you haven't nodded off like your man in the picture.